Good morning, Sanctuary Covenant Church. As I mentioned last week, our passage for today, Revelation chapter 14, is a particularly difficult passage to preach on. This is true for a number of reasons. First, it's difficult for the same reason that so much of the book of Revelation as a whole is difficult. It was written almost 2,000 years ago to a people who lived 7,000 miles away from where we live, which makes Revelation a book that is both ancient and foreign to modern readers. And though that is true of the entire Bible, it is especially noticeable when reading Revelation. It also contains layers upon layers of symbolic imagery, most of which would have been immediately understandable to the original audience, but which requires us, so far away in time and space, to do a fair bit of homework in order to recognize the references, let alone the meaning. Which is the third difficulty of all of Revelation that makes Revelation 14 difficult as well: the references. Revelation is very referential. It borrows from and remixes images and ideas from throughout the Old Testament and first century contemporary culture. To those highly familiar with the Old Testament, who'd studied it as the only Bible they'd had since they were young, as the original audience would have, Revelation reads as a collection of brilliant literary callbacks. But for us less biblically steeped modern readers, it often just feels confusing. On top of these common difficulties with Revelation as a whole, chapter 14 adds a few of its own. First and foremost, it contains judgment language that is not only foreign, but downright offensive to most modern ears. Revelation 14, 9-11 talks about the result of following the beast being eternal conscious torment while the Lamb and his angels look on. Revelation 14, 17-20 provides the image of an angel gathering clusters of grapes from the earth and then trampling them in the winepress of God's wrath until blood flows out of the press and fills an area the size of Israel, chest deep in blood. It's just not an easy or especially pleasant read. And to be completely honest, I even briefly considered skipping over the chapter entirely. But if we believe that the Bible is God's Word, and that in the Bible God is revealing Himself to us, then we must accept that even the difficult portions have something to say to us about who God is, who we are, and what God is seeking to do in our lives. And so instead of rushing past this difficult chapter, I'm actually going to take a little extra time on it, examining its three main sections in three different sermons. And so today, this sermon is part 1 of 3 on Revelation chapter 14. We start with verses 1-5, which say, "Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven, like the roar of rushing waters, and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless." Before we get into the details and application of this passage, it's important to understand where it falls in the ongoing narrative of Revelation, its literary context, and how that connects it to the passages immediately before and after it. That's going to be key in interpreting this chapter correctly. One thing that's particularly helpful to understand if we're going to interpret Revelation 14 is that it concludes a section that began back in chapter 12. See, Revelation as a whole is broken up into sections of interconnected visions that are best understood by first relating them to each other and then pulling back and seeing how they connect to the book as a whole. It's like narrative arcs in a seasonal television show. Many shows do this. Each episode has its own story, but then they each connect together in the narrative arc of a particular season of the show. Season 1 tells one story, Season 2 tells another. And that's why it's difficult with some shows to start watching in the middle. If you haven't seen what comes before, what you're watching won't make as much sense. And it doesn't stop just with watching one season. There's also a broader narrative arc that runs through an entire series. And so each episode is connected to a season, and each season is connected to the series. It's the same with Revelation. By my count, we're in the 4th season, the 4th narrative arc of Revelation. Last fall, we started studying Revelation and looked at chapters 1, 2, and 3, which contain the messages to the 7 churches. That was season 1. And then in January, we looked at the central and centering vision of Revelation, contained in chapters 4 and 5, the revelation of the throne of God and the Lamb who was slain. That was season 2. Then in February, we looked at Revelation 6 to 11, which detailed the first 2 cycles of 7, the 7 bowls and 7 trumpets, which describe in symbolic terms the problems that arise from the world operating in a way that is distant from or antithetical to God's intention. That was season 3. Now we're looking at season 4, an interlude that began in chapter 12, which tells the story of the great war between God and the devil as it plays out both in heaven and on earth. And so chapter 12, which is about the woman, the child, and the dragon, retells the story of Satan losing the war in heaven through the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ. The chapter ends with the dragon, the devil, enraged and going off to wage war against Christians who are living faithfully on earth. He's enraged because he's already lost the war, but he hasn't given up fighting against God's people. Chapter 13 then describes the tools Satan uses to wage war against God, against God's people, and really against the whole world at large. And those tools are described as 2 great beasts. The beasts of Revelation 13, Satan's tools according to Revelation, are meant to represent the military might of empire, the Roman Empire specifically, and empire in general, and the machine of disinformation that supports empire's power. The second beast, who symbolizes political and religious propaganda, deceives people and causes them to worship, to serve the first beast, who represents the empire or political powers. And now we don't have to look far to see how this same reality exists in our day and age. Lies are used regularly to deceive people into unwavering allegiance to a political party or a person, so much that they won't even examine facts presented from another point of view. According to Revelation, this is all part of Satan's plan to deceive the world and steal glory from Jesus, the Lamb who was slain, the only one who's worthy of worship and allegiance. Well, that brings us to chapter 14. Which has the 3rd, 4th, and 5th episodes of Revelation season 4, if you will. Where chapters 12 and 13 describe the great war and then Satan's tactics moving forward, Revelation 14 describes God's tools, God's actions in response to Satan's maneuvering. The point of the passage is to encourage the believers on earth to remain faithful to God and the Lamb no matter what, which points to the reality, which is also expressed elsewhere in Revelation, that a big part of God's strategy for beating Satan is wrapped up in the faithfulness of Christians standing firm against the devil and his beasts of empire and misinformation. So Revelation 14 gives us 3 pictures, each of which expresses a theme or a tool that God uses to defeat the devil. Revelation 14, 1-5, today's text, describes the first of God's strategic tools for resisting the enemies of power and misinformation, and that is faithful worship by faithful people. Earlier in Revelation, we're given glimpses of the heavenly worship that is going on at all times and in all places. Chapters 4 and 5 especially describe the scene of God on the throne in heaven and all of creation singing his praises. There's a callback to this scene in Revelation 7 when God seals the 144,000 who represent the people of God, and then this great multitude in white robes proclaim that salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. These are incredible scenes of heavenly worship. Revelation 14, though, introduces us to a new scene of worship, But instead of it being the heavenly worship service that we've seen before, this one is described as being on earth. Verse 1 describes the Lamb, who is Christ, together with the 144,000 faithful followers of Jesus, bearing the mark of the Lamb and standing on Mount Zion. Mount Zion is a name used throughout the Old Testament to refer in a general sense to Jerusalem, and more specifically to the hilltop where the temple was built. Psalm 2, which is one of the inspirations for this vision in Revelation, talks about the promise of the Messiah and says, "I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain." And so when Revelation 14 describes Jesus and his people standing on Mount Zion, it's declaring once again that Jesus, not Caesar, is king. This message that's repeated over and over in Revelation. But the vision doesn't stop there. Verses 2 and 3 go on to describe a sound from heaven that is like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. This is the same language used earlier to describe the voice of God when God speaks. And then the sound is compared to harpists playing their harps. And finally, verse 3 says that the gathered multitude sang a new song before the throne that no one could learn except those who had been redeemed. Verses 4 and 5 then describe the characteristics of this crowd by saying that they were sexually pure, that they follow Christ, that they're surrendered to God and are truth tellers. Now, this passage, as with the vast majority of Revelation, is meant to be taken figuratively. It's not a literal lamb. It's not a literal 144,000 people. It's a very large group. And they're not literally standing on Mount Zion. But the image of the faithful following the Lamb and worshiping on Mount Zion is meant to show us that one of God's primary tools for resisting the demonic powers of the empire and its propaganda is the faithful worship that we earlier saw happening in heaven, now breaking out on earth. Revelation 14 is describing the answering of the prayer, "May your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." It is the inbreaking of heaven on earth. And remarkably, what this is describing is what is meant to happen every single Sunday when the church gathers for worship. Think about it. Think about it. The passage describes a gathering of Christians on earth. The next thing that happens is they hear the voice of God, the thunder and rushing waters of verse 2. In response to the voice of God, they break out in the song of the redeemed, and they are described as people whose ethics and morality have been transformed by following Christ. You see, this is God's first response to the evil that we see in our world: faithful worship by faithful people. Which begs the question, how seriously do you take worship? Now, before you answer that, I want to say something about worship. The word worship has unfortunately lost a lot of its original meaning over the years. To most modern ears, the word is synonymous with singing or singing in church. But worship in the Bible is much more than that. Singing is but one way of worshiping God. And it's not the only way, nor even necessarily the best way. And I say that as someone who loves to sing worship to God and whose primary role in the church for 15 years was leading the singing of worship songs. But Romans 12:1 contains what I believe is the biblical definition of worship, and it goes far beyond singing. It says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." According to Romans, true and proper worship is the surrendering of our entire lives to God. It's offering our hearts, our souls, our minds, and our bodies to God to use how He sees fit. Jesus in John 4 said that a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. Worship is a whole life response to the revealed greatness and glory of our loving and powerful God. And this sort of worship, this whole life response to the revelation of God's power and His grace, is not only what pleases God, it's also one of the first things that conquers the evil powers at work in the world. Because the empires of the world, these empires propped up by propaganda and whose authority and power lie in violence and exploitation of the marginalized and the oppressed, these empires can be brought down by faithful worship of the Lamb. Christianity eventually defeated the pagan Roman Empire, not by picking up swords, but by faithfully worshiping the Lamb no matter what. A worship that included serving the poor, taking care of widows and orphans, refusing to take part in the misinformation campaigns of the empire, and being willing to die rather than renounce Christ and his ways. So when we read these verses in Revelation 14, 1-4, I think we've got to ask ourselves, how seriously do I take worship? Is worshiping God an afterthought? Is it just something I do once a week? Is it relegated to singing a few songs every now and then that are directed to God? Or is it a way of life? Is it me continually crawling back up onto the altar, surrendering myself to God as a living sacrifice for God's glory and neighbor's good? My prayer for you and for me this morning is that our worship, our very lives, come to look more and more like the latter. That we would be able to see ourselves when we read the descriptions of faithfulness in Revelation, and that we would grow both in attitude and actions into looking more and more like Jesus. We'll see you next week.